Are joined now from Westminster by Lord President of the Privy Council, Jacob Rees-Mogg, a key figure in the decision that was made yesterday to suspend Parliament. So let's talk about this proroguery, if that's even a word. I'm sure you will know. It's interesting, isn't it? Your own cabinet members are calling this move undemocratic.
No, they're not, because I think two things are being conflated. One is the routine beginning of a new session to set out the domestic agenda, which is what is happening. And the other is the suggestion that was going around in the leadership election for the Conservative Party that you would suspend Parliament from July through and beyond the 31st of October. I was saying at the time that that was absurd. No sensible person was in favour of that, in my view. That would have been constitutionally improper. But we have a new session of Parliament normally every 12 months. This session has already run well over 2 years. We are not losing many days parliamentary debate because it coincides with the conference recess. So this is routine. It's actually quite boring. But the arch remainers who don't want us to leave the European Union have started crying constitutional crisis, but actually they're crying wolf.
OK, this is interesting. This is what Boris Johnson said to Sophie Ridge here on Sky News in June. He said, "I don't want, nor do I expect to prorogue, not attracted to it. I don't think it will be necessary." It's interesting, isn't it, the timing of this, because let's be straight here, you're doing this to get Brexit done by the 31st of October.
No, that's not right, because Parliament will come back in early October and we'll have lots of time to debate Brexit. But crucially...
How much time?
Well,
we're estimating 4 or 5 days.
No, the key here is that the European Council takes place on the 16th, 17th of October. That will be when any decision is made on any agreement, and then there will be 13 days after that to debate and implement an agreement if one is come to. So that's the key period when Parliament needs to be sitting, and Parliament will be sitting, but it also crucially means we can have a new Queen's speech and we can get back to talking about the NHS, dealing with crime, improving people's standard of living.
But that will eat up time, won't it? Because after the Queen's speech, there'll be 4 or 5 days of debate then. That also eats up time.
Well,
and you have to admit, MPs, if they'd have been allowed to continue without this suspension of Parliament, they would have voted to stay put instead of disappear for party conference season.
Well, let me answer your 2 points individually. The debate on the Queen's speech has nominal areas to debate day by day, but actually you can speak on any matter relating to the Queen's speech. So people could spend the whole of those 4 to 5 days debating leaving the European Union, and they could put down an amendment to the Queen's speech or to the humble address, thanking the Queen for her speech, saying things about the European Union. So that is 4 or 5 days which can be devoted to Brexit. In terms of the conference recess, at my first and so far only outing at the dispatch box, I referred to the conference recess and said I expected it would go ahead, and the opposition chief whip nodded in agreement, and that's all recorded in Hansard. So it had been agreed that the conference recess would go ahead, as it always does. Parliament hasn't sat in late September for 80 years.
Do you admit, though, that this has made it harder for MPs to stop a no deal? You won't admit it's the main aim of this move, but it may be a convenient byproduct.
I don't think it is, actually. I think those who don't want to leave the European Union have to screw their courage to the sticking point. That there are 2 ways for them to stop us leaving the European Union. One is to change the government, and the other is to change the law. They don't seem willing to do either of these 2 things, because actually 17.4 million people voted to leave, and they don't want to blow a raspberry at more than half of the electorate. And that's why they cry constitutional crisis, which is actually cover and code for them trying to keep us in the European Union against the law of the land and against the referendum result.
It's interesting, then, you're saying they have 2 options, either change the government or change the law. Let's talk about some extreme options the government could use to carry on and get Brexit through on the 31st of October. These have been talked about. One of them is that if MPs do manage to pass legislation to stop a no deal, Boris Johnson could simply ignore it. Would he do that?
Well, you can't ignore legislation. The law is the law, but the law has to be precise. So I don't know what law you're proposing would be passed.
Well, it may be that he has to go back to Brussels to seek an extension, for example. Would he ignore that if that was the option put to him?
Well, you'd have to see how the law is phrased. The Prime Minister will obey the law. The Prime Minister believes in the rule of law. Our whole system is based on the rule of law. And crucially, what is happening now is in line with the rule of law. And the oddity now is that this Parliament has gone on so long, and having this chance for a new Queen's speech is actually really energising, because it means we can get back to the issues that have been ignored for the last 3 years. So we can get back to improving the NHS, to dealing with knife crime and so on.
Yeah.
And
So if
that's
MPs
what's at the
pass
heart
legislation, Boris Johnson will follow that. OK, if MPs don't manage to change the law in the 4 or 5 days that they will be sitting, there's a prospect of a no confidence vote. If it succeeded, would Boris Johnson resign or would he continue?
Well, the question there is, would Parliament have a majority for another leader, and who is putting his or herself forward for that? It seems to me that Mr Corbyn does not command and has no prospect of commanding a support of the majority of the House of Commons, so they'll have to look for other figures. The constitutional norms are always observed.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you say that you want to focus on the domestic agenda. That's what the suspension is all about. But a lot of people are seeing this as a bit of a ruse, because Parliament hasn't passed any domestic agenda in a year, even more unlikely to do so with just a majority of one. So again, I go back to the point of being straight. This is to subvert Parliament and clear any obstacles to leaving the EU on the 31st of October. People just want you to be straight with them.
No, you've put it brilliantly, absolutely superbly, and thank you. You've put the case for the government. This session of Parliament has stopped passing any useful legislation. It is an adult Parliament. It needed to be brought to an end so you could have a new and fresh session of Parliament that would be able to start with new bills. You can't bring in complex new bills towards the end of a session, because there isn't time to get them through all the stages, knowing...
How more likely are you to pass any of these domestic bills with a majority of one, with people preoccupied by Brexit?
The Labour Party wants to improve the health service, I imagine. The Labour Party wants knife crime to come down. The Labour Party, I imagine, wants to see people's standard of living improved. There are many, many things that Parliament can do where there is lots of support, and sometimes you get political shenanigans and people pretending to oppose things that they're in favour of. But that doesn't mean you can't get important domestic legislation through.
OK, suspending Parliament for 4 to 5 weeks. I mean, I look at, prorogue periods of years past. In 2010, it was 3 days, 2012, 7 days, 2016, it was 5 days. This is highly unusual.
Well, it was deeply selective, if I may say so. In 2014, it was 20 days. In 1997, it was 19 days.
In 2015, it was 3 days. This is unusual for 4 to 5 weeks. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says the PM is acting like a tin pot dictator. You're setting a dangerous precedent here, aren't you?
Look, I'm afraid Nicola Sturgeon's default position is faux outrage. If the Prime Minister said Christmas Day was the 25th of December, Nicola Sturgeon would be outraged and shocked by that. So I wouldn't worry too much about what the Scottish leader has to say. I think the key point here is sitting days. We are not losing many sitting days. We may only lose 5 sitting days, which is completely routine and in line with the figures that you were giving.
OK, and just finally, how confident are you of a deal being reached? Boris Johnson originally, when he went into number 10, said it was 1,000,000 to 1 chance of not getting one. He said it was reasonable after the G7 meeting at the weekend, which is quite the scaling down. What are the chances of it as it stands today?
Well, it takes 2 to tango, and it will be up to the European Union to decide whether it wishes to have a reasonable deal or whether it's going to insist on vassalage, in which case we will leave without a deal.